in our lives, all of us as human beings face some desperate situations. And a lot of times in those desperate situations, there can be a great amount of pain that we experience. It can feel like there's no way out of the rut that we're in. There's no solution, or there's no answer to our problem. And that type of hardship often makes a person feel helpless and hopeless. And it's usually during those times that our lives take a dramatic change, and that's usually for the worst. And it's also, I think, at these very difficult times in our lives, these times when we are experiencing great hardships, that Satan often rears his head. I think that we can be more prone or more susceptible to sin and to temptation during those times. And from this point on in our study of David, at least I guess we should say through the rest of the book of 1 Samuel, David is going to live a very severe, very hard life. There's going to be a lot of adversity that comes into his life. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, take it and turn over with me to 1 Samuel chapter 21. We're going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22 this morning. And remember that we're studying a series in the life of David. And when we left off last week, David had become a fugitive. Remember that he was running for his life. And Saul was determined that he was going to execute David. He was determined that he was going to kill him, and so he's fiercely pursuing after David. David had been warned by Jonathan, Saul's son. Remember that Jonathan told him, don't delay in making your escape. You know, don't go back, don't get anything. You need to just take off and run and get away. Now, what's interesting about this point in David's life, I think a lot of times we read about it and we think, well, you know, David went through a rough time for a couple months there, or even a year. But this is actually a period of time that's going to cover about 10 years in the life of David. And during this time, we're going to see numerous occasions where David was tempted to sin. We're going to see occasions where Satan knew that David was in a very vulnerable position, so he tries to get him to do something that's wrong. Now, when we first started this study, remember that I pointed out, you know, David is a man who's described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. And so what that means is there's going to be a lot of examples that we study within the life of David that are going to be positive in nature. However, that doesn't mean that he was perfect. That doesn't mean that he never did anything that was wrong. And so we're going to look at an occasion where sin and temptation got the better of him. And we want to look at that from the standpoint of what can we learn about when we're going through these hardships, when we're going through these difficult times, and Satan tries to tempt us to sin. What can we learn from David's situation and what happened in it? Notice in 1 Samuel chapter 21, we're going to begin in verse 1. But the first thing that we want to talk about is whenever we're tempted to sin, we need to figure out, we need to confront whatever the cause of that sin is. We need to figure out what is leading us down the road to sin and what is causing us to sin. Notice in verse 1, it says, Then came David to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, Why art thou alone, and no man with thee? Now remember, David and Jonathan have just had a conversation. Jonathan has warned David to run away. And so David runs to Ahimelech, who we read about here in verse 1, and he is the high priest. Now you've got to, again, just stop for a moment and appreciate the gravity of the situation. Here is David, the king's son-in-law, and basically Saul has put out an execution order on him. And so where can he go? Who can he turn to try to find help? Well, the first person that he turned to was Jonathan, Saul's son. And there wasn't really anything that Jonathan could do for him besides comfort him, make a covenant with him, and warn him about Saul's anger that was being directed toward him. And so if you're David, where are you going to go next? Well, maybe the high priest can do something, right? Maybe the high priest can help me out in this difficult situation. And so David flees to Nob, which during the times of Saul, that's where the makeshift tabernacle, I guess we could say, was set up. And so it stayed there within the city of Nob, and that's where the high priest was abiding at this time. So David arrives. And immediately when David arrives upon the scene, Ahimelech is suspicious because David is all alone. Now you might think, well, why would Ahimelech be suspicious of David being all alone? Remember that David is Israel's most famous warrior. Okay, and usually he's a commander of an army. And so wherever David goes, usually there's an army behind him, or there's people probably much like the life of Christ who were, interested in him and surrounding him. But here he arrives on the scene and he's all alone. And so Ahimelech asks the question, he says, how is it or why is it that you come to me alone? In verse 2 it says that David said unto Ahimelech the priest, the king hath commanded me a business, and hath said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee, I have appointed my servants to such and such a place. Now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, and what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread under my hand, but there is hallowed bread, if the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days, since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it was sanctified this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. Now I want you to understand what is happening here. Here comes David. He comes to the high priest. The high priest notices that he's all alone, and so he asks the question, why have you come here? And notice what the reply of David is. David said, I have come on the king's business. And the king has commanded me to not let anyone know about this secret, super secret mission that he sent me on. And so I'm not supposed to tell anybody about it. I'm not supposed to talk about it. I can't give you any details about it. And my men are waiting for me in a certain place, a certain appointed place. Well, you know what that is? That's a lie. And I mean, David just came out, flat out lied to the high priest of God. And so he asked him the question. He's obviously in a difficult situation here. And he's scared. He's probably tired. He's undoubtedly hungry. Because he asked the priest, he says, I'm on this mission from the king and we need something to eat. Do you have anything here for us to eat? Do you have 5 loaves of bread or anything else? And the priest said, we don't have any food here. The only food that we have is the showbread. The bread, the unleavened bread that only the priests were supposed to eat. And evidently this was the day that it was being replaced. And so he says, if these men, your army that you have waiting for you are holy, if they're not undefiled, if they're not unclean, if they've kept themselves at least from women, and that's kind of a token act of a person who is sanctifying themselves in the Old Testament, he said, then they can eat this bread. And what does David say? Oh, we haven't been with a woman in 3 days, all of us. And so we'll take the bread. Well, when you think about it, he's just lied right to Ahimelech. And the reason that he's lied, what caused David to lie? Well, I think there's a lot of things that we could look at, but I think the bottom line was fear. He's afraid that Saul's going to kill him. He's afraid that if he goes to Ahimelech and says, listen, Saul's put out an execution order on me and I'm trying to escape, can you give me something to eat? He's afraid Ahimelech isn't going to help him out. And so this fear is what causes David to commit a lie. In verse 8, we read, and David said unto Ahimelech, and is there not here under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me. because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it. For there is no other save that here. And David said, There is none like that. Give it to me. Well, here he's already lied about, this super secret mission that he's on, and I don't know about the state of his cleanness or uncleanness, but he's basically trying to cover everything up. And so now he tells Ahimelech another lie. He says, this business, this mission that the king has sent me on was so urgent that I didn't even have time to grab any weapons. I didn't pick up my sword or my shield or a spear or anything like that. And so, is there any weapons that you have laying around here that you can provide for me? Well, obviously the tabernacle is not usually going to be a place where swords and spears and shields and everything are laying around. And so Ahimelech says, the only thing that we have here is the sword of Goliath. If you want to take that, you're welcome to take it. And of course, David jumps at that opportunity. We talked about in a couple lessons ago how that sword stood as a reminder of the faithfulness and the power of God. But it's interesting that here's David, and he's scared, he's running for his life, and here's a token of God's faithfulness and God's power after he has sinned. So what is causing David to sin? Fear. And friends, I think we need to understand there's always something that tempts us to sin. There's always something that is pushing us toward sin. And if we don't figure out what that is and we're not willing to confront it, then the problem is we're just going to keep on sinning, aren't we? We're just going to keep on doing the same thing over and over again. Now that could be, like in the life of David, it could be fear. Fear could be causing us to sin. It could be something like discouragement. Sometimes when we get discouraged, we do things that we shouldn't. We violate God's law. It could be greed. It could be the lust that we have, a desire for pleasure. But we need to figure out what that is, and we need to confront it. Because until we do, that sin is going to keep reappearing in our lives. In Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 19, the wise man would write, The lip of truth shall be established forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. There's a problem with lying, and that is it usually doesn't last too long. Solomon talked about it being for just a moment. And you might look at David and you might see what he did and you might think, well, no big deal, right? David lied, but in the end, he got food. He got something to provide for his hunger. He got defense through that lie. He got a sword to help defend his life. And nobody was really hurt. So what did it really matter if David lied here? Well, we haven't read the rest of the story. Because when we read the rest of the story, what we're going to find is that this lie set off a chain reaction that has horrible consequences with it. And a lie may get you out of a jam temporarily. It got David some food, it got him some safety temporarily, but in the end, it's not going to last. There's always going to be consequences that come with that sin that we commit. And so the first thing that we need to learn from studying David's life is that when we're tempted to sin, we need to confront whatever the cause of that sin is. The second thing that we learn is we need to calculate the consequences of committing that sin. Notice in verse 10, we read, And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. He stops at Nob, he talks to Ahimelech, he gets some food, he gets a sword, and then he runs to Gath. Now you might recognize the name of that city because it's actually the city from which Goliath came. And so it's not an Israelite city, it's a Philistine city. But David is probably in his mind thinking, well, I'll go the last place that Saul would ever come for me. If I live in the heart of this Philistine city, Saul's not just going to march in there with his army and just grab me out of the crowd. There's going to be a fight. There's going to be some resistance that breaks out. And I'll go to the safest place that I know. Well, what happens is we read later on that David is recognized. Notice in verse 11. It says, the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land? Did not they sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000? And David laid up these words in his heart, and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And he changed his behavior before them, and feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let spittle fall down upon his beard. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see, this man is mad. Wherefore then have ye brought him to me? Have I need of madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? You know, you think about David here. David, somehow the Philistines recognized him, and I almost have to wonder, was it by Goliath's sword that he was carrying around? You know, we read about Goliath's weapons, and they weren't any ordinary sized weapons that he yielded. And so maybe they recognized this is the guy who's going to be the next king of Israel. And so the servants of Achish say, you've got to watch out for David. And it almost seems, as you're reading the story, that at some point in the story, he's apprehended and he's brought to the king's palace. And so in the effort to kind of clear himself in the eyes of the king, he pretends to be crazy. You know, we read about David drawing on the walls of the palace. And he's letting a drool or spit run down upon his beard and drip off. And so Achish says, this isn't the guy who killed all these Philistines. This guy is crazy. You know, this guy is a madman. I don't need him in my court to do something to cause me harm or somebody else. And so his estimation was, let's just let him go. Now you think about David's behavior. He is one of the greatest heroes that Israel has ever seen. He is one of the greatest warriors, fighters for the army of God and the army of Israel. But he's reduced to acting like a lunatic. And why is he acting like a lunatic? Well, it's because he's put himself in this difficult situation, right? He's put himself among the confines of the enemy. And he is afraid as he is standing within the Philistine city. Well, this act eventually works and his life is spared. But do you think David ever thought in his life that he'd have to act like a lunatic? Do you think he ever envisioned himself having to draw on walls and let spit or drool run down his face? I mean, this was part of the consequence of what he was suffering. In verse 7, in 1 Samuel chapter 22, you know, David escapes after he leaves Gath. He goes to a cave in Adullam. And when he goes there, his family comes to visit him. And then not only does his family come to him, but also all the outcasts of Israel, all those who owed a great debt to Saul, all those who were discontent with the reign of Saul or had somehow portrayed themselves as the enemy of Saul, all these misfits and these rogues and these outcasts come to David, and the Bible tells us that the number of that company is about 400 people. David has to make a decision. He says, what can I do with my family to keep anything from happening to them? And so he decides that he's going to send his family to live with the king in Edom. He puts them under his protection. And then what happens is Saul hears that David has been sighted. Remember, he comes back out of the land of the Philistines because that didn't work out. And now he's back in Israel, and Saul hears that he's been sighted. And in verse 7, we read about Saul saying unto one of his servants that stood about him, Hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? That all of you have conspired against me, and there is none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests that were in Nob, and they came all of them to the king. So Saul hears about David being spotted running around here, and he says, none of you guys are on my side. He takes his soldiers and sets them down. He said, none of you are trying to help me. None of you are trying to keep the kingdom from being ripped out of my hands and given over in the hands of David. All of you are conspiring against me. Even my own son has conspired to side with David in this. And so Saul is trying to create, I guess you could say, an atmosphere of pity among his soldiers. And then Doeg stands up and he says, I saw something. He said, I saw David, and I saw him come to the city of Nob, and I saw him talk to Ahimelech, and I saw Ahimelech give him food, and I saw Ahimelech give him a sword, the sword of Goliath, and send him on his way with a blessing. Now remember that Doeg was present. We read back in 1 Samuel 1. He was present whenever David came in to Ahimelech and these things were transpiring. And so immediately in the mind of Saul, remember, he's so paranoid. He's so fixed on this idea that everyone is out to get him and destroy him and take his kingdom away, that he immediately accuses Ahimelech of coming up with this conspiracy with David. In other words, he was aiding David. He was helping his cause. He was trying to deliver him out of the hands of Saul, and he was trying to help him be the next appointed king of Israel. And so he calls for Ahimelech and the priests that were in the city of Nob. Now, if you go on, you read through the chapter, you'll find that that was 85 priests, or 86, I guess you could say, that arrived upon the scene to come before Saul. And Saul lays this accusation out. Somebody saw you aiding David. Somebody saw you giving him something to drink, giving him weapons to fight with. And Ahimelech just vehemently denies any idea that he's involved in this conspiracy with David to dethrone Saul and to take over his kingdom. And so in verse 14 of 1 Samuel 22, Ahimelech answers the king, and he said, who is so faithful among all thy servants as David, which is the king's son-in-law, and goeth at thy bidding, and is honorable in thine house? Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Be it far from me. Let not the king impute anything unto his servant, nor to all the house of my father, for thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. You see what Ahimelech is saying here? He's saying, I didn't have any idea that this was what was going on. In fact, he points out in verse 14, when I see David, here was what I saw. I saw a faithful servant of Saul. I saw a man who is the king's son-in-law. I saw a man who did whatever the king asked him and to do. I saw a man who was honored within your house. And so what I thought I was doing was actually honoring you. I thought I was siding with you by helping your son-in-law and this great soldier of Israel who is honored in your own house. He says in verse 15, he evidently asked of God something for David. And he said, is this the first time I've ever asked God in behalf of David for something? You know, is this the first time I've ever inquired of the Lord for the cause of David? Did I just start that day when David came in? I've been doing this a long time. And any time that David came to him, he would inquire of the Lord for him. And so he points out he didn't know anything of a plot against Saul. He didn't know anything of David trying to dethrone him. He just thought he was helping the king. And he thought he was honoring the king by honoring his servant. If you look in verse 17, it says, and the king, that is Saul, said unto the footmen that stood about him, turn and slay the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled, it did not show it to me. And the king, but the servants of the king would not put forth their hand to fall upon the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, turn thou and fall upon the priests. And Doeg the Edomite turned, and he fell upon the priests, and slew on that day 85 persons that did wear a linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, smote he with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and sucklings, and oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. And we're talking about the idea you have to calculate the consequences. Do you realize why these people died? They died because David told Ahimelech a lie. They died because Ahimelech believed what David told him, that he was on this super secret mission from the king, and he didn't have time to get any food together, and he didn't have time to get any weapons together, and his army was waiting for him in an appointed place. And because Ahimelech believed that lie, he helped David. And what did it cost him? It cost him his life. And not only did it cost him his life, it cost him his family's life, and it cost the priest of Nob their life too. It was David's own lie and his own deceit that led to this occasion. And friends, that's how sin often is. You know, a lot of times, I pointed out before, people say, well, what's the big deal if I sin, right? It's only going to affect me. And that's sometimes how we look at sin. But did David's lie just affect him? No, sin not only affects us, it affects those around us too. And it caused these people to lose their life. Did David ever think of that before he ever committed this sin? And what's interesting is he did. He thought of the fact that Doeg was sitting there, and this is the chief servant of all of Saul's servant, and he's witnessing these things that are happening, and he knew that there was potential for something bad to happen. But you know what? Even after he considered the consequences, he went ahead and he did it anyway. Remember what James wrote in James 1:15 and 16? He talks about the idea of how we're drawn away of our own lust, and then he says, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. And sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And then in verse 17, he gives this warning, do not err, my beloved brother. What is the consequence of sin? Well, the ultimate consequence of sin is death, isn't it? How many of us really sit down and think about that before we ever commit sin? How many of us really ever sit down and calculate the consequences of what this act, this violation of God's law, the potential that it has to affect other people, and the potential that it has to lead us to an eternal place of punishment? I think we often forget to calculate the consequences before we sin. But I'm convinced that if we did that, if we honestly sit down and calculated the consequences before we sin, I don't think any of us would do it. But a lot of times that slips our mind. When we're tempted to sin, one of the things that can help us is stop. Think about what's going to happen because of this. Think about how it's going to affect other people. Think about what it could ultimately do to us when it comes to the aspect of eternity. David did that, but he kind of ignored it and went ahead and carried on anyway. And so we need to be careful about that. The third thing that we want to point out, studying David's life here, when we are tempted to sin, and this is assuming, as David, we've given in, we've committed sin, we've given in to the temptation, we need to confess the sin that we've committed. Notice, as you go down in verse 22, we read about, in between those verses, that one priest escapes from this massacre of the city of Nob, and that is the priest Abiathar. He runs and he finds David, and he joins up with David, and he tells him about what has happened to his family. And David stops whenever he tells him this story, and I think he takes a minute to reflect about his sin, about what had happened because of his fear and his lack of faith, and the fact that he never intended for this to happen. But I mean, when you look at sin, how many people, when the consequences come, say, well, that's what I thought would happen. We never intend for bad things to happen, right? But they did. He never intended for his sin to have such serious consequences, but it did. And so in verse 22, David said unto Abiathar, I knew it that day. Notice that. I knew it that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of thy father's house. Abide thou with me, fear not, for he that seeketh my life seeketh thy life, but with me thou shalt not be in safeguard. What does David do? David immediately confesses the sin that he was guilty of. And when we talk about confessing our sin, that's what we're talking about. When we confess sin, we need to own that sin. We need to lay hold of it. We need to claim it as our own. Abiathar is telling David about what has happened here. David is feeling responsible, and rightly so, for the massacre of his father's family. But you know what he didn't do? He didn't blame Saul, did he? He didn't say, well, this is old dirty Saul and his fault. You know, that's just the way he is. He mistreats people, doesn't think about anybody but himself. David didn't even talk about him. He says, this is on me. I knew it the day that I did it. Our confession needs to lay claim to our sin. He wasn't a victim of circumstance. He doesn't try to blame other people. He doesn't make an excuse for himself. He just takes personal responsibility for what he's done. You know, some of the greatest psalms that David wrote, I think, are psalms that acknowledge the idea that confess his sin. In Psalm 32 and verse 5, David said, I acknowledge my sin unto thee, and mine iniquity have I not hid. I said, I will confess my transgressions unto the Lord, and thou forgavest the iniquity of my sin. This verse is a great verse of an example of proper confession, because David personalizes his sin. He uses 8 different personal pronouns in that one verse, where he claims that sin as his own. And he also uses 3 words in that verse, if you look at it again, to describe his actions: sin, iniquity, and transgression. Listen, friends, it's not a matter of if we're going to do wrong. It's just when we do wrong, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to take responsibility? Are we going to own the sin that we've committed? You know, that's an idea right now that as a father I'm trying to impress upon my children, not to encourage them to do wrong, but to understand there's going to be times when you do something wrong and you get caught in it. And when you do, what's the proper reaction? The proper reaction is what David did. It's to acknowledge what you've done wrong. It's to confess your sin. It's to own up to those things. If we don't personalize our sin, then really we're just trying to offer an excuse for it. And so David lays claim to this confession of his sin. And not only do we learn that our confession needs to lay claim to our sin, we also learn that it needs to be communicated. It's not something that goes unspoken. In fact, it's obvious when you think about sin, first and foremost, it needs to be communicated to God, right? Because He's the only one who can forgive us of our sin. In Psalm 38 and verse 18, David said, I will declare mine iniquity, I will be sorry for my sin. 2 things that we need to communicate. Number 1, we need to declare the fact that we've done wrong. And the idea isn't just declaring it. I just don't declare my sin to God so that I can go out and do it again, right? That's not the purpose of my declaration. It's so that I don't do it again. The second thing that he talks about in that verse is being sorry. And whenever we communicate with God, we need to communicate the idea that we are sorry for what we have done. If we're not sorry for what we've done, then we'll go out and we'll do it again. But those are things that need to be communicated in that confession. I'm reminded of another verse in Psalm 51 and verse 3, where David said, I acknowledge my transgressions. Remember this, the latter part of this verse? He said, my sin is ever before me. David talks about the idea of this sin being ever present in his mind. You realize David gives Abiathar a pledge here. He pledges that he is going to protect him because he is the one who's responsible for his father's family losing their life. And for the rest of his life, David said, stay here with me. But the rest of his life, every time that he sees Abiathar, don't you think David was reminded of that sin? My sin is ever before me. God forgave him, but he had to live the rest of his life with the memory of how this sin had affected those around him. Sometimes we talk about the memory of sin. The memory of sin isn't all bad if it can help us from sinning again. And that was something that David often used, this idea of his sin being ever present before him. You can read about the same idea with Bathsheba, Solomon, many different examples. We need to be careful, though, during difficult times in our life, because I think a lot of times those difficult times make us more susceptible to sin or to temptation. And so we asked the question this morning from studying the life of David, what should we do whenever we're tempted to sin? The first thing that we have to do is consider what is causing us to be tempted. Consider us what is leading us or pushing us toward this sin. In David's case, it was fear. And until that was dealt with, it wasn't going to magically push him away from that sin. And then we need to be sure that we calculate the consequences of that sin. Sit down and really think about it. What is this going to do to others? What possible repercussions might happen because of this sin? And ultimately, eternally, what might happen because of this sin? And if we go ahead and we give in, even though David did, even like David did, then we need to be sure that we confess that sin to God. We need to be sure that whenever we confess that sin, we lay claim to what we've done, and we need to communicate to God the fact that what we did is wrong, and we're sorry for it. And if we'll do those things, there's a great formula within these two chapters for what we need to do as Christians whenever we're tempted to sin. Maybe there's one here this morning who's not yet God's child. Maybe you need to obey the gospel of Christ. Or maybe you've already done that and you've not been living faithfully for the Lord and you need to respond in a public way. Friends, if there's any way that we can help you this morning, assist you, we'd ask you to please come forward.